I am Les Roy Williams. I thank you very much for joining us for our program today. Of course, your company from week to week is well appreciated. Today, we are going to be having a discussion on disaster preparedness. Of course, we know that we have started the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season, and that runs from the 1st of June to the end of November, November 38. And of course, every year we have to prepare for disasters. Every day, actually, we have to prepare for disasters, natural disasters, what we refer to as acts of God. And it is important that our preparation is important, because when we prepare, we can mitigate against the damages to property, loss of life, and so on that disasters usually cause. Today I have with me officials who work in terms of disaster preparedness from the National Emergency Operations Center, and I will introduce them to you. I have with me the Deputy National Disaster Coordinator, Mrs. Clarissa Langley Stevens. Mrs. Stevens, welcome.
Good afternoon, thank you.
I have with me Mrs. Janelle Lewis Tafari, and in addition to being the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Social Development and Gender Affairs, Mrs. Tafari is the Chair of the Welfare, Relief Supplies and Shelter Management Subcommittee on the NEOC. Welcome, Mrs. Tafari.
Thank you, and good afternoon.
Additionally, I have Mr. Valentine Lindsay, and Mr. Valentine Lindsay is no stranger to you, and he is Chair of the Housing and Shelter Subcommittee. Mr. Lindsay, welcome.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you.
Right, so here we are. Of course, we know that the hurricane season has already begun, but of course, when we speak disaster, it is not just about hurricanes. Presently, we are undergoing a disaster. It's a public health disaster. It's a health disaster, the COVID-19 pandemic. And any disaster preparedness these days, we have to do it in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we have other disasters. We can have floods. We are going through right now a drought. That's also a disaster, a natural disaster. We can have earthquakes, we can have tsunamis, we can have volcanic eruptions, as we have seen in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So disaster is really a comprehensive, when we speak about disaster, we speak about it comprehensively. Now, Clarissa, could you tell us the role of NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, and its comprehensive disaster management strategy?
Thank you so much, Mr. Williams, and good afternoon to the viewing and the listening public. The National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, as it is affectionately referred to, we are actually a coordinating unit. Many persons over the years would have viewed or branded NEMA as a hurricane-centric office. And at 2016, the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, through CDEMA, our parent organization based in Barbados, would have signed on to the Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy. And what that is, it positions the agency here in St. Kitts and the Nevis Disaster Management Department on Nevis to be able to embrace protocols and standards that would ensure that we are no longer viewed as a hurricane-centric office, but we look at all hazards with the inclusion of all persons, looking at the policy level, the operational level, the strategic level, and the volunteer, which is the community level. So everybody has a role to play, and that's basically what CDM is. The agency in itself had to go through a process of transformation and build capacity to be able to develop partnerships with our stakeholders that would ensure that we continue to move away from being hurricane-centric and to be that of a more comprehensive nature. This is being guided by the National Disaster Management Plan that the agency would utilize to be able to make decisions and recommendations to the government in preparation or to respond to any impact. Now, NEMA is a very small staff, and at the agency we know that we cannot do it alone, and that is why we are supported by entities such as the National Subcommittee chairpersons, some of whom are with me today here on the panel, and they are primarily responsible for looking at developing plans and strategies to be able to support some of the critical areas that we have to give attention to. You've already alluded to two, and then I just want to share with the general public that you too, Mr. Williams, is a national chair responsible for warning and communication and education. And then when you look at the other components of NEMA at the national subcommittee level, we're seeing a subcommittee responsible for environmental issues. There is also a component that deals with damage assessment, damage and needs assessment. There is the National Transportation Subcommittee. Additionally, there is one for public utilities, initial clearance and search and rescue, public health, which is, which has been activated over the last 2 years to be able to support the impact of COVID-19. And then, of course, last but not least, the Foreign Assistance Subcommittee. So we have covered, we've blanketed all of the critical areas that would allow for the agency to have that support. Now, of course, because NEMA is coordinating, we bring all of those moving parts together. And the hierarchy that supports the administrative team at the agency, we answer to an authority that is referred to the Mitigation Council. So the National Mitigation Council is the governing authority that guides the actions of the agency. And the Mitigation Council, as of recently, has gained a co-chair, and so the Honorable Attorney General, Vincent Byron, is the chair for the Mitigation Council, and the Honorable Wendy Phipps is the co-chair to support the efforts of the National Mitigation Council. And that is a decision-making body. You would find permanent secretaries, heads of departments, heads of NGOs and other stakeholders, also with representation from NEVIS. And so you have the staff of the agency, the national subcommittees, you have the National Mitigation Representative Body led by ministers of cabinet who can be able to bring the information from cabinet and, of course, return some of the discussions that are happening there. And then you have our volunteer mechanism, and that basically makes up the ability for the agency to coordinate efficiently and within a timely manner, as well as to be able to build capacity at a national level through training and all other opportunities that are available to us. And we want to continue to do that as a small agency with great responsibility, and of course to do it in an efficient and effective manner. So that's basically the agency in a nutshell.
Okay. Now, Clarissa, we're in the hurricane season, the 2021 hurricane season. Already we would have seen that we had Hurricane Elsa. And Hurricane Elsa impacted already some islands in the Caribbean. I think Barbados and St. Vincent and the Grenadines was another that it impacted. And every year, we can be sure that we have a hurricane season. It is part of the calendar. While we do not have earthquakes and tsunamis and things like that, they can happen at any time. We know that every year there is a hurricane season. And with the season, we can at least expect some sort of a cyclonic activity. Now, what is being done in terms of hurricane preparedness, or what can you tell the audience in terms of hurricane preparedness? How should we prepare, and what is the importance of being prepared?
Thank you for those questions.
You said that Nima was looked at
as hurricane-centric. Well, actually, that's exactly where I wanted to jump off to say that we have been doing hurricanes for so long over the years that I think that we would have gotten a lot better in our preparedness initiatives. But the one important thing that I want to start the response with is to say that the agency is guided by a disaster management cycle. And any action, any course of action that is taken from NEMA's standpoint would see us operating in 4 basic capacities. The first one is preparedness, and that is an ongoing effort. It doesn't stop. And then we are going to move to our ability to respond. And so response is very important, just as we are responding now to the impact of the COVID situation. And then there is the opportunity for recovery. And also from the disaster standpoint, where we can, we mitigate. And so you would hear in our conversations in disaster management that we would always speak about preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation, because they mean something to us. As it relates to hurricane preparedness, it is an ongoing effort. And we do a lot of our preparation through training to support capacity building. You would find that we would train not only our staff, but our volunteers and other government and private sector entity representatives to be able to support us. And you would find training in so many areas to include, but not limited to, shelter and shelter management. We also do a lot of training in initial damage assessment, or you would find us doing training in communication. And I kind of want to just go back to communication, because one of the things that we realize is that information is very powerful. And during a time when you are preparing to respond to a tropical cyclone, the one thing you want is for when persons are being communicated to, that the right temperament is presented in our messaging. You, for one, Mr. Williams, understand the dangers of presenting information in a way that it seems that you should be panicking, when rightfully you're just trying to educate and make aware and empower the citizens and residents. And so we have done a lot of work through our communications unit at NEMA. And I really want to commend Vesta Southwell, our public relations officer, and her team for the continuous efforts in emphasizing the importance of information and how you use that information in decision-making processes. Additionally, one of the critical training areas for us in disaster management is to ensure that our volunteer mechanism is up to date with basic training to include basic first aid and CPR. Because at the end of the day, they become first responders at the community level, and we've seen it at work. I know we would have shared some moments in 2017 with Irma and Maria, where we would have gone through a series of occurrences where our district volunteers were really put to the test, and because of the training that they would have been exposed to, that really helped with their level of preparation and ability to respond within a reasonable time. I know for a fact that we were faced with some challenges, and case in point was the fact that at the time when we were impacted in 2017 with Irma Maria, we were also dealing with red eye. I don't know if you remember that, Mr. Williams. And the shelter managers, who are volunteers, they were faced with the challenge of having to determine when persons come to the shelter who have red eye. And you know, when you have red eye, you can't be exposed to everybody. And so, that's right. Say that again? Conjunctivitis. And so that presented our volunteers with the excellent opportunity to be able to do what they would have been trained to do, and that is to tap into the resource of health, the health personnel, to be able to make determinations and, of course, distinguish and safeguard the persons, because even though you come to a shelter and you have red eye, that don't mean we should put you out in the cold. So their training would have taught them how to handle such a sensitive situation. So we believe that training is the way to go. You cannot go wrong with training. We are in ever training mode at the agency. We pride ourselves, and we always encourage our stakeholders to be able to reach out to us, not necessarily for us to facilitate the training, but to give access to the resource that would allow for successful training to take place.
Okay, Mrs. Stevens, we'll come back to you. But as you mentioned in your intro, that dealing with disasters is a multifaceted approach. It is a multi-stakeholder approach. And you mentioned, of course, the various subcommittees that there are at the National Emergency Operations Center to be able to comprehensively, that word, manage disaster. And I have Mr. Lindsay, Mr. Valentine. You are the chair of the Housing and Shelter Committee. What is the role of that committee?
Well, we basically have to prepare before there is a storm. And when I say prepare, it is termed housing and shelter. And so our role is to examine the number of properties around the country that is used or earmarked for shelter. Now, there is a team from a number of different government departments, public works, planning, social development, and also we have persons from the churches, ecclesiastic affairs, Christian council, and we also have personnel from social housing and social, human settlement. That's right, my own ministry, human settlement. And so we would have crisscrossed the country just about 3 months ago, looking at the different community centers, looking at certain sporting complex, and also some church buildings. And so the idea is really to ensure that the sanitary facilities are adequate, are in order, are in working condition. We also would examine the integrity of the buildings, the roof, the windows, the doors, to ensure that they are safe and they are secure and they can withstand any gale force winds. And so we also would look at whether or not the venue is accommodative to persons in wheelchair. And so we would make recommendations wherever we would see any issues that need to be corrected. We will make recommendations to the appropriate persons. That is, whether it is public works or whether it is social development or sports department or even to the churches. We'll make a recommendation as what needs to be done.
Okay. Now, what are some of the major challenges, Mr. Valentine, that you have at shelter sites?
Well, as you will know, Mr. Williams, I just newly was appointed chair to this committee. But even going around to these community centers, and I would speak more to the government facilities, the community centers, and also the pavilions. In going around close in time before, you can always see when the government would have made investments to improve these community centers. And looking at it close hand as the chair of the housing and shelter, you would see a lot of vandalism. You go to these shelters and you would recognize that some child would have probably passed and throw a stone and knock out a glass. You go to some of the community centers, you recognize a door for the bathroom is gone. Simply means that somebody thought that they needed a door and they just hook off the door. And so I believe that we have to continue to educate our people to recognize that when the government would have made investments into their people, it is for the betterment of all. And as such, public property is to be safeguarded and to be protected. And so that is one of the challenge. Some of the centers, just a few, I think out of the 45, just about 6 or 7 of them have wheelchair access. And so we now have to consider this as a necessity, as an important need, and we need to really retrofit some of these centers to accommodate wheelchair activities or the differently abled personnels.
Right. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have community centers, as you said, that we use for shelters. How does that work with the COVID-19 pandemic? We're hearing about social distancing. How do you social distance in a community center?
Most community centers will have an open space or a number of open spaces. And PAHO would have gave us some guidelines as to the number of square footage per person when it comes to spaces for shelters. And PAHO would have recommended 36 square foot per person. I think here in St. Kitts we're already at 40. Most of the calculations for all of the spaces we have is at 40 square feet. And so we're already ahead of what PAHO would have been asking for. Now, most times once you have a disaster, you would have cots and you would have, different things. And so one of the idea too is to have the cots toe to toe, meaning that you would not have, if you have the first row, you have the person's feet at the south, then the next row the person's feet would be at the north. So that way you wouldn't have any cross contamination if there is any issues. You'll also have to ensure, well, if persons who are speaking about the wheelchair too, you would have extra space and an extra foot for persons with the wheelchair. And so these are some of just a few issues that you would take on board to bring us in line with the COVID protocol and what is required for COVID.
Now, Mrs. Tafari, your subcommittee is somehow related to that of Housing and Shelter subcommittee, but you deal more with the management side of it, the management of the shelters, welfare of people in those shelters, and in terms of relief supplies. Now, could you tell us a little bit more in terms of your role, the role of that subcommittee?
Good afternoon again, everyone. Okay, I believe that Mr. Williams would have pointed out a few of the things that we do. The committee is called Welfare, Relief Supplies and Shelter Management Subcommittee. So basically, our committee is responsible for ensuring that persons have access to their basic needs. So we are responsible for ensuring that supplies are entered into the country, they are processed, and they get into the hands of persons who need the supplies. We're also responsible for doing the initial assessment after a disaster to determine what are the needs of the persons on the ground. This information is then fed onto other subcommittees, such as the Foreign Assistance Subcommittee, who in their capacity now would reach out to our embassies, our consulates, and other sponsors to try and get supplies to the country. When persons have to be placed in a shelter because of a disaster, we have the responsibility of ensuring that they are safe in that shelter, that they are as comfortable as possible. So we have to ensure that they receive all their meals. We have to ensure that if there are any medical needs that must be attended to, that we are aware of those and we can assist them. So once a person is registered into a shelter, we have to do a basic registration, find out who they are, their age, their sex, if they have any non-communicable diseases, if they're taking medication, if they have any allergies, if they have any dietary restrictions. And this helps in the planning going forward. We also have to ensure that persons, if they have any allergies or dietary restrictions or for religious purposes, when we're planning the meal preparation, that these are taken into consideration. Not because you are in a shelter that we are going to disregard your dietary restrictions or your religious beliefs or your cultural beliefs. So you're in a shelter, we're not going to feed somebody, for example, from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, pork. We have to ensure that we respect your religious beliefs. We are going to try as much as possible to ensure that persons who need to take medication at a certain time have access to their medication. This means we have to work closely with the Ministry of Health. We also have to ensure that persons, while they're in the shelters, because it is going to be a trying period for them. Yes, we may say that once you have life, you have everything. But for somebody who may have lost their home, all of the material things that they would have worked hard for over several years, and they're worried about where they're going to go to, what they're going to do tomorrow. There's going to be anxiety, they're going to be nervous, so we have to make an effort to try and address those psychosocial needs of the person. So again, we work closely with the Mental Health Subcommittee in that regard. We also have to ensure that persons are safe within the shelters. We know that in a shelter situation, we sometimes come across situations of sexual molestation, violence, etc. So we have to ensure that the shelter managers are trained to address these matters. They are alert enough to be on the lookout for any of these things that are occurring, and that they're able to nip it in the bud. With the COVID-19 pandemic, there has to be some changes to shelter management. So once the shelters are identified by the Shelter and Housing Subcommittee, we have to ensure that the preparations are such that we are in line with the COVID-19 protocol. So there has to be adequate sanitization stations, enough hand sanitizer dispensers, soap, towels, that there is proper cleaning practices on a more frequent basis, so that we don't end up having two emergencies, having persons who are homeless and need to be in a shelter, and then persons who come down with COVID-19, and then we have a medical emergency that we have to contend with.
Okay. Now, Mr. Lindsay, who deems the shelters fit for use? And what would be some of those things that you would look for to really approve that a shelter is in a state of readiness? And how are the shelters, how are these sites, how are they chosen?
Well, there is always a historical list that you would start working from. But from time to time, you would have new facilities coming on stream, and so those facilities can also be examined. For instance, the additional buildings that are added to this year's list would have been the community center in Lodge, and we also have the Explorers Club headquarters in Malfield. That is another facility that was just added this year. So we have to look at whether or not the integrity of the facilities are sound. And so one, we would start, when we started examining the buildings, we'll start with the roof. We check for leaks, we check for the rafters, the T111, we check on top of the roof itself whether the shingles are adequate, if they need changing, if there is any old galvalume or galvanized. Those are the things we look at. Then we come down, we look at the windows, whether you have proper ventilations, because we have one community center, all the windows are sealed. And in a setting where we have a disaster, that is not adequate. And so we would have recommended for that center that we would have to get new windows in order for that center to remain on the list. And so these are some of the things that we would identify. I know that there is a program presently to outfit the centers with emergency doors. So you have some of the centers now have a more solid door, and one that you can just push a lever and the door opens quite easily in the event that persons are inside and you have any issues where you actually need to come out in a rush. So there are some efforts to improve the doors. So some of the centers already have proper hurricane force winds doors that cannot easily be blown in. And so those other windows that we have, like shattered glass and so on, we would have made recommendation to change those windows. And we also looked at, I guess over time when we're putting in new windows, have impact glass to ensure that the windows are hurricane rated, so that even a regular stone from a child will not be able to shatter the glass, because it is impact glass in the first place. And so, because that would help in the event of any missile thrown across the room from the hurricane gale force winds. And so these are some of the issues. Now, we would have spoken to the bathrooms. And the ideal setting is to have sanitary posts where you have both bathrooms and showers. So for those centers where we recognize, for instance, the community center in Half-a-Tree, we would have recognized that it do not have any showers. So my department would have made the drawings for the showers, would have forwarded to Public Works as a recommendation as to this is the size of the shower. We think that we should have 2 showers here in this, if this facility were to remain on the list. Because you do not want a setting where it is used for a hurricane shelter and the bathroom is not attached to the building. There are some bathrooms there on the property. So if the situation is probably a volcano issue or so, persons can just go out to the bathroom. But in a hurricane setting, it is not appropriate for the bathroom, the showers not to be attached to the community center. So those are things that we look at. Again, I must stress, because it is very important, the facilities in terms of wheelchair access. It is not a must, but we are suggesting, and we have seen the last 2 new buildings that came on have wheelchair access. So we can see that there is an effort to going forward to ensure that that is part of the conversation. And so we also would look at the actual, the structure itself, whether it is, the block work, the wood, whether there's any termites and that kind of stuff, because, all that can weaken a property. And so, because some of the buildings that we use as shelters are church halls, and so most of those buildings are, close to 100 years. And so, from time to time, we'll have to look at that as well. And then, even though some of them have these stone work, you still have to look for any cracks and that sort of things. And so, these are some of the things that we look at. Now, we would have someone on the committee from Public Works, who is, can look at those engineering aspects of whether or not, is structural. And they have a whole team. So in the event that you see something, you can really just go back to the office and bring a team to look at it. And so I believe that we are well positioned in order to test whether or not the properties have sound footing.
Okay, at what point does a person decide to go to a shelter? At what point? For example, if there's a hurricane and I know that my house is built on sand, for example, can I go into the shelter before the hurricane hits?
What I can say from my understanding, that shelters really should open 72 hours after the passing of a hurricane. But from last year, I am advised, I think from last year, some of the shelters opened before the storm. So it seems as if that we are now moving slightly away from opening the shelters after the storm and have some of the shelters open before the storm. And so once that happens, once shelters open before the storm, then we can assess the persons who deem that their structures are not sound. I believe some work can be done in terms of investigating and determining whether that is the case and accept that person in the shelter.
Yes, Claricia.
So in 2017, just to support what Mr. Lindsay said, we found at the mitigation level, we found it necessary to be able to activate some of our primary shelters to be able to accommodate the request of persons who felt that their homes were inferior and did not have alternate arrangements to be able to utilize the body system that the agency would normally present. And so the Mitigation Council agreed to activate 8 primary shelters on St. Kitts to be able to receive persons who may feel disadvantaged. Because bearing in mind that we were actually looking at being affected by a Category 5 hurricane. And so those were circumstances that allowed for us to move away from opening after, because you wanted persons to do everything in their power to be safe and preserve life, because the preservation of life and safety comes first in all of our efforts at the agency. And from that 2017 occurrence, we recognized that the model of opening our shelters prior to the impact of a storm worked a lot better. Of course, not having all 33 or 60 of the shelters opening, but managing in the various NEMA districts how many shelters will be activated, their location, and how they will be manned by the shelter managers. And as PS Louis Safari said, getting the necessary resources in those shelters to accommodate the persons who would have utilized that as one of the options for being safe and sheltering the storm.
Because one of the questions I have, if someone needs to move during a storm, they need to flee during a storm, and the shelters are closed, where do they go? Because you said you would open the shelters after the storm. But then people would have been exposed to dangers during the storm if their roof went and other things. They're in harm's way. So where do they really go?
Well, from what I think the part of the body system
Yes.
supposed to use to address that. And body system, I can imagine, would mean your neighbor next door. And so you can, and most times, even sometimes in our culture, you know, sometimes we don't be speaking to our neighbors. But when it comes to disasters, you know, persons just forget what happened 2 years ago, 10 years ago, and they just open the place. And, you know, that is the kind of people we are here in St. Kitts, that there are times when people just put aside, you know, these negative things and move forward. So the body system would work well there, because sometimes, even though we know that somebody roof has gone, getting to that person even from the rescue point of view may be a challenge. Okay, so the body system in my mind is...
In mind, we are in a COVID-19 environment. How would that work?
Everyone has to protect themselves. And even in that, even in a disaster, you still have to try and practice your masks and your distancing and so on. But I can tell you, you know, having 70, 80 gale force winds out there blowing, persons would really tend to try to be safe first. But yes, you are correct. This COVID environment have us to rethink a lot of things, and in some persons, you know, opening their houses, you know, to persons may be a problem. But I believe that you know, good sense will prevail in terms of reaching out and helping your neighbor.
Yes, and we have to always be thinking safety first. Even if my house roof goes, I'm not going to try and get to a shelter, because the shelter is most likely going to be farther away than my neighbor. And if I do go by my neighbor and the storm is over, I am supposed to remain there until the all clear is given. And then, once the all clear is given, then I can leave and try to get to the shelter if possible.
And to support my two colleagues, I think the reality of the situation as we operate in the context of COVID, it has brought to the forefront that our challenges are very real. And I do agree with Mr. Lindsay when he said, because I always say it in my presentations, people wonder why I love the hurricane season. I believe that if ever we're impacted, that's the time when you see togetherness and responsible enough behavior where persons look out for one another, despite whatever the history might have been. And in this case, with the presence of COVID in our environment, and of course having to deal with a diminished version of community spread, I believe that it is through education and awareness that we are going to champion the cause of the agency in terms of persons actually putting together a family plan. In the absence of a family plan, you are just sitting ducks waiting for something to happen, and we'll figure it out when you get to that stage, and that is not best practice. The agency, through its communications unit, continues to emphasize the importance of a family emergency response plan. And it's not only for hurricane preparedness, it goes beyond that. And basically what it is just having a conversation or a set of actions that your family members would know of as to what should be done at a given time, bearing in mind what hazard you are responding to, and taking the right steps to be able to ensure that all family members are kept safe at that time. So in the case where it is the preparedness for the Atlantic hurricane season, the basic plan would see something like having the emergency supplies kit, having a go bag ready for persons in your household, especially if there are persons in that household who are vulnerable. persons from who are elderly, persons with special needs, persons with disability, things of that nature. It is important for households to have these plans. Where are these items located? Starting to identify who your NEMA representatives are in your community, get a contact number that you can have available to be able to make that call in an emergency situation. Know where the shelters are located, and not just the shelters. Know where the approved shelters are within your NEMA district, within your community, because that really helps to cut down on time. And I particularly like the fact that P.S. Lewis indicated that it is important for any action to be able to wait for that all clear. Because the all clear means something. It means that we are asking you to stay put until we as an entity, the NEOC, not necessarily NEMA, the NEOC would indicate to you that it is okay for you to come outside, because we would have sent persons outside prior to ensure that the down power lines are cut and moved from the main roadways and the flooding has subsided and things of that nature. So we want persons to understand in their preparedness efforts that allowing themselves to be exposed to information that could help with the planning of their households, I think that is what would really help the agency in advancing its mandate of persons being safe and, of course, embracing our mantra from danger to safety, because that is the only way that we are going to get the citizens and residents to fully be in a position to respond to the call of the agency prior to an impact, and after we can be comfortable knowing that they would have the necessary steps in place.
Okay. Now, thank you, Clarissa. Mrs. Tafari, who are some of the persons that would make up the shelter management? For example, do you have health personnel? Do you have counselors at these shelters and so on to be able to deal with the needs? You spoke about the psychosocial needs and health needs and so on.
Okay. The volunteers from the community play a critical role in shelter management. So they are often the frontline workers. These are persons who, just out of the goodness of their heart, have offered to assist in this capacity. They don't receive any pay, and we have to be grateful to them because they are leaving their own households, their own families during a crisis to come out and assist others. But they also get support from the ministry's staff. And as you would have mentioned, there are times when they do need support from the Ministry of Health. So the nurses are also readily available to us, as well as the counselors, the persons from the counseling unit, the Mental Health Association. On our committee, we do have representation from these various entities, because we realize that social services can't cover all of this alone. So the Mental Health Association, the counseling unit are a part of our committee, also the Ministry of Health, and also the Defense Force and the St. Christopher and Nevis Police Force. And they are here because security and safety is a primary concern for persons in the shelter. So, as needed, these persons would be available to assist with the shelter management.
Now, Mr. Valentine, who are some of the members of the Housing and Shelter Subcommittee?
I can say I can tell you what the committee should have made up of, and then I can tell you who the members are, you know, like everything else, right? Okay, so we should have one person from the St. Kitts Nevis Chamber and Industry and Commerce. We should have one person from Social Development, and we should have one person from Ecclesiastic Affairs, Evangelical Association, and the Christian Council. And we should have someone from the Government Building Inspection. I think most likely that will be Public Works. We should have one person from the Hotel and Tourism Association, and we should have one person from the Lands and Survey, and we have representative from NEMA and representative from Nevis. So that is what the committee is made up of, those different departments, persons from those different departments. Yeah, that's what it should be. But presently we have someone from the Evangelical Association, and we also have Mr. White from Public Works. We have Mr. Simmons and Mr. Simmons from Planning. We also have Mr. Herbert from Planning. We have Mr. Pemberton from Sports Department, and we also have a member from NEMA, which is Mrs. Petty, and we also have someone from my office, Mrs. Dora Warner, and we have someone from Social Development, which is Mistress Bridgewaters. Yes, and I believe that those are the persons who attend to our meetings, and I must say that it is a very good bunch. Persons who are willing to work and always pay attention and always have something to recommend going forward. And so I'm happy to be the chair of that committee. I think we are from Nevis. I must call, yes, Mr. Dyer is the person who really is supposed to be at that meeting, but I think he sent two representatives from Nevis, which is Mr. Paris, and I am not, the other name gone from me now, but anyway, but yes.
That's okay. Now, who approves the list of shelters in the long run? And do you think that shelters nowadays, they should start thinking in terms of getting tanks, for example, for these shelters, or having shelters with cisterns? Because then people get into a shelter and then water becomes an issue, and that is a recipe for disaster.
My committee would have done the work. We would have made recommendations to Cabinet. And so Cabinet will give the final approval of the shelter list. And so they too may have shelters to add to that list. And so there's where the approval will take place. My information is that they were just about probably a year, 3 years ago or 2 years ago, BNTF would have done a project which would have outfitted most of the community centers, if not all the community centers, with at least a 5,000-gallon water tank. So some of the community centers would have these 5,000-gallon tanks at the top on the roof, as well as in the yard. And so in terms of water, that is something that has already been spoke to before and have addressed. I think, though, the challenge we have with the situation with these tanks, we have to have constant maintenance of these tanks. But while we're on that, too, I think, too, our building codes would soon have to address cisterns and water storage, because we recognize even in our sister island, Nevis, maybe coming out of their history, you would find most of the houses there are built with cisterns. But here in St. Kitts, we are accustomed to turn on the tap and water flows out of the tap. And so we have not been thinking along those lines. But we would recognize in recent times we would have had some challenges with water. I was recognized we are presently, as you said earlier, that we are in a drought situation. And so we, as a people, would have to consider having water storage going forward in order to assist in this.
Yes. Clarissa, you would have mentioned about the family emergency plan as one of the plans that people must have in place in the event of a natural disaster. What are some other tips that you can give to people in terms of what plans they should have in place in the event that a natural, something impacts us?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Williams. So one of the campaigns that we are presently engaged in is that of a tsunami ready campaign. And of course, St. Kitts and Nevis has been certified as tsunami ready. And I know our partners from the University of Puerto Rico and UNESCO, one of the things they always state in our meetings is that, you know, a tsunami can occur at any time during a pandemic, while we are responding to the impact of a hurricane, and then here comes a tsunami. So it means that our preparedness efforts should be comprehensive enough that it allows for households and families to understand that you're not just preparing for hurricanes. Now, an emergency response plan for a family can be applied to any hazard. And I know at the communications unit at NEMA, we have a lot of material that we put out on social media to be able to allow for persons to get the basic tips required. Now, coming back to hurricane preparedness, one of the challenges that we have always encountered is that persons do not avail themselves to hurricane preparedness information until the Met Office announces that we are under threat or we are going to be impacted. And to me, by then, it's way too late. You have to start the hurricane preparedness way in advance of an impact, because then it helps with the preparedness initiative. From a family standpoint also, and we can't say this enough, in putting together your emergency supplies kit, we found that persons would have contacted us at the agency during an impact to let us know, you know, I have the flashlight, but I didn't buy any batteries. Or I have the candles, but I don't have any match because all of them got wet and things of that nature. And I know a young lady who would have contacted us in 2017 where her roof would have been blown off, and thankfully she had reached out to the agency on a personal level to be able to ask, what are some of the things that I need to put in place? And so she quickly put her documents in the Ziploc bag and had it secured so that, you know, if the roof went off, water wouldn't damage her important documents. Water storage was something that was done. And I like to use her personal story because it helps. Because she lived in the house at the time with a young baby and an older mother who required insulin, medication that needed to be refrigerated. It means that you have to have some sort of plan in place that suggests how will you secure your insulin medication when you secure them from the pharmacy, because you don't know when again a facility would be open for you to be able to access these resources. And you may not be one of the persons going into a shelter where the resource might be available there. You might be embracing the body system and that family is not in a position to help. So you need to be able to have your own readiness measures in place. One of the other challenges that we've found with persons in terms of their own personal preparation is that we have a cell phone, and for some reason we keep forgetting that one of the first things to be impacted is that of electricity. So the batteries on the phone, well charged, but we are in response mode for at least 3 days. One battery might not be able to last for 3 days. No thought of getting any extra battery or a backup phone or something of that sort. We don't think down that down the line. And then the other challenge that we were exposed to from personal testimonies, from testimonies of persons who were impacted, is that they didn't put aside any cash because in their mind, card is available. But we know that the ATMs are usually inoperable after an impact. But if you have, you know, some monies, the community shops might be open to be able to help you to get some of the resources that you need. And this is the point where I will remind the general public that it is important, it is of paramount importance during the hurricane season, especially as we move to the peak in September, that we do not continue the practice of purchasing in bulk the perishable items. You want to invest in non-perishable, long-lasting foods that have a longer shelf life. basic things like canned products, the tuna, the sardine, the salmon in the can, or the crackers and the oatmeal and flour and those things. Not the fish and the salmon and the beef and the pork, the chicken. No, because when electricity goes, and I really have to commend Skelec here, Skelec has been doing very well in terms of keeping our electricity on, even as we stand to the winds of Category 5 hurricanes. They did tremendously well. They are part of the NEOC, and I really want to commend them. But we still want persons to be responsible when they're putting together these emergency supply kits. Having a first aid kit, I can't tell you how important that is. It is extremely important to have an adequate first aid kit, because sometimes when we go out to institutions and make presentations and we switch to the personal component of preparedness, many persons will tell you they do not have a first aid kit. They don't see the need for it, because on a normal day they can run to a health center. But during an impact, the health centers are not operational. So we're asking you be able to have these resources to do a quick fix on you or whomever in your family might be injured until you can get to the professionals who can help you. So there are lots of things that can be done at the household level, and we want persons to be ready to respond.
We'll continue on that, but we're going to open up the phone lines. The numbers to call are 466-2666. That's 466-2666, 662-8674, 662-8674, 767-4765, 767-4765, and the overseas number is 1-239-645-4500. That is 1-239-645-4500. We welcome your calls. Right. So we are speaking here in terms of general preparedness, hurricane preparedness, and some of the things that, we might overlook. Some very simple things that, like you mentioned, the cell phone, having an extra cell phone charged, having a little cash so you can go to the shop because ATMs are usually down, having a transistor radio, having batteries, having little kerosene for your lamp and all this kind of thing. I don't know if people still use that kerosene lamps.
Yes, you do. Yes. I have one. I have a kerosene lamp.
I know now you have these battery-operated fluorescent lamps and so on, but we don't wait, you said, until the last minute. There's a story in the Bible about people getting their oil for their, you all know that story? And they wait until the last minute. And when the last minute was there, they didn't have enough time, so we have to be wise.
And that contributes to the long lines. You'd find that we leave everything that has to be done, our grocery shopping, getting our extra medication, we leave them until an announcement is made, maybe by yourself or Mr. Samuel at the NEOC brief that we're going to be impacted. And by then everybody has a bright idea. I need to get into the supermarket, I need to get some petrol, etc., etc.
How do you deal with people who, we have a call. Working for you, good afternoon.
Joy. Yes. And the all the guests at the table. I'm here listening to the program. And I notice you all been telling us the necessary things that are needed at these shelters. And I understand that some of the shelters now have what you call hurricane-proof glass, which you call a shatterproof glass. And those windows are very, very expensive, I can tell you, because I visited them in Miami. And the cost of the hurricane, these what you call community centers that will be used for shelters, the cost is very high. And I suggest that the government get proper security to protect these buildings from vandals. I heard one of you say that in one of these community centers, a bathroom door was stolen, gone. Now, that deal comes from what you call lack of proper security. In there, that someone can go in a building and scrap a door and go with it. Now, we need proper security around this building because of the cost. Some years ago, at the NHC and East Park Range, some thieves went upstairs in the CHA building and take out some computers. Well, they had a watchman there. They always got a watchman there. But is there the quality of the watchman? Not because somebody old and they don't work on the toilet and they're not able to move around physically like other people. You're going to give them a job at certain places of a high value of money to be security. No. These things, you need better security around them to protect them because it's a lot of money invested in these buildings. So I just hope that they will look into this and secure these property because they're expensive. Thanks for taking my call.
Working for you, good afternoon. No, there's no caller. Okay. Would anyone want to respond to that, Mr. Valentine?
Well, yes, I quite agree. I think that we have to impress on our engineers to use these impact glass windows so that we can ensure longevity, and also in the event of any hurricane, we can assure that the security of the persons inside would be there, would be paramount. And so I think that we need to look at that. We also need to ensure that the doors, as I said earlier, is a project that has started, and I believe that we just need to finish it, because also went into another community center and I saw a number of doors there. So I am impressing on those persons who are given the job to do that, which I believe is one of our departments, to try and finish that. Recognizing that we are already in the hurricane season. But I must say too that, on a personal note, that there are other things that some of us can take on board. And I would have recognized when we look at the disaster supply kit, and my colleague spoke to the perishables. But if we were locked down for just 4 days, and we saw those lines, it sort of tells me that our people do not take this serious. It's either that they were planning a party at home or they just didn't have anything in their houses. So I believe that we have to really look at least having 4 days supply of food in our houses. But I also believe that, as individuals, we also have to look at, whether there are trees around the house that needs to cut down. If you have any electricity wires and there are trees that are close to these wires, we can also call on the electricity department to assist in cutting them down. I'm not saying that as an individual we go and cut down any tree that is very close to an electrical wire, but the electricity department offers that service, and it is a free service, and so we can pay some attention to that. I also believe that some of us probably may need to invest in storm shutters. There are some that can stay up the duration, and there are some that you can take down and pack in a storeroom, and once the season comes around, you can go and put them up. That latter one I prefer, because sometimes when you would have spent thousands of dollars to build these shutters, when you leave them up the entire time, you eventually would rot if they were done out of wood. So I believe that these are some of the steps that we can take to ensure that we protect our properties.
One of the things that we as a Caribbean people have to do is that we have to build with hurricanes in mind. Hurricane-proof buildings. We know that we live in an area, the geography. where we live, that we have hurricanes every year. And what you were mentioning, Mr. Valentine, is important. We have to bear that in mind and build accordingly to be able to make our homes more resilient towards hurricanes and so on. I know, for example, in places like New Zealand, where they have a lot of earthquakes, and in Taiwan and in some of those places, that are on the ring of fire. It's a ring of fire. They're prone to a lot of volcanic activity, earthquakes, and all of that deal with that sort of phenomena. They build their homes on shocks, so that when there are earthquakes, the shocks absorb a lot of the movement and so on, and so the homes don't, are less likely to.
That is why I speak to, we have to revisit our building codes. And also to one of the things that, one of the very first things that came out in our first meeting is that we need to build now with safe rooms in mind. Because, so going forward, houses that have more than 3 bedrooms, one of those rooms should be a safe room, especially if you do not have a concrete roof. You should have a safe room. So we should build with safe room in mind. That would assist us now in the shelter and housing, meaning that once your roof were to go, there will be a safe room, so you do not have to rush to a center. You can be accommodated in your own space. And so I believe that we ought to encourage our people to build safe rooms.
I also want to add and share with my colleagues and the general public that because of the occurrence of 2017 and the experiences of Irma and Maria, the government has sought to ensure that NEMA now sits on the building board. There is that representation from the agency standpoint where we have a seat at the table, and just as Mr. Lindsay is proposing that we look at our building codes, and NEMA is at the table to be able to make a meaningful contribution to what is our way going forward, what needs to happen to ensure that our homes can withstand. It's no longer a category 3, but more a category 5 hurricane or the threat of a hurricane. So I think that having the agency be a part of that important decision-making body would really see a level of discussion that would be more to the benefit of the citizens and residents and homeowners and business owners. So I really do thank you, Mr. Lindsay. And I'm happy for the opportunity to enlighten the general public that we are going to be working closely with the building board to be able to get some of these things on stream.
When we look at even just St. Vincent, you would recognize that a number of persons' houses were damaged simply because the ash that fell on the roof became too heavy for the roof, and so the roof collapsed. And so you have some persons, every week they will go back to the area just to brush the ash off of their roofs. And so I believe too, we now have to, we believe that our volcano is dormant and inactive. But we too, looking at the building codes, we not just have to consider the shear force winds, but whether, the T111 and the struts are strong enough to bear any weight, even in the event that we have any situation with ash. Yes.
Mr. Williams, there are some other resources that the agency has been developing over the years, and I'm very happy to speak to the particular area of mapping as a tool that we have been using to help persons with decision making. And I know vulnerability mapping, risk assessment mapping, and some of those tools that we have would include a tsunami inundation map. We have a flood zone map. We have a volcanic zoning map, which tells you which aspect of the volcanic zone you live in. And I think that through our planning unit, and that unit is headed by Mrs. Orika Lennon-Petty, we have been doing a lot of work in partnership with the physical planning department to be able to ensure that we not only have these tools, but we are able to introduce them to the general public and to be able to educate persons of the usefulness of these tools so that persons can integrate them into their decision-making and planning processes. And the case in point is this, as Mr. Lindsay spoke about what happened in St. Vincent. At the agency, we believe that it is important for persons to know which part of the volcanic zone they reside in, because where you reside is determines the level of response that we expect from you. So those of us who live in the red zone, we need to know that in the event that something happens with our volcano, we are going to have to do a mandatory evacuation for the red zone. It means that you must get out of that area as a precautionary measure. And I know over the time, we have the training and development unit, which is a unit that I head at the agency. When we do presentations outside of NEMA, persons always tend to ask and of course work with the assumption that if the volcano had to affect us, it would affect us in the daytime. I don't know why. Or if a tsunami was to affect us, it would affect us in the daytime. So we are always conditioned, oh, I'm going to be at work, in town, and my child is going to be in school, in the rural sides, and so. But we are asking that when you use these tools that are being developed by the agency for decision-making purposes, that you factor any time of the day or night, because that would really help with the efficiency of your response. As long as you know you live in this zone, when an announcement is made, the natural reaction that we want from you is like, okay, I'm in the red zone, I'm going to have to evacuate. And when you evacuate, where am I evacuating to? You understand what I'm saying? Because in this case, you can't be looking at PS Safari Lewis for the shelters, because it means that the shelters in the red zone, they're non-functional. You cannot look to them. You have to look for the shelters in the orange zone, and as we move forward closer to Bastia.
From my understanding, the red zone for us here in St. Kitts is from Newton Ground round to Tabernacle. And so those areas...
Well, it takes in some more, but yes, that's the general...
The general red zone. And so the shelters in those areas, you're saying, would be closed in essence, yes. Non-functional. And if we were to look at Nevis, the entire Nevis, I understand, is a red zone. So it means if we have any activity there, then our shelters here in St. Kitts would have to be activated. Yeah, just...
what the maps are saying to us, so that we can know the appropriate actions to take if and when that becomes our reality. And the funny thing is, we always say in presentations that are specific to volcanic eruptions that, and we're using it as a reminder, that the Seismic Research Center based at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago has already signaled to the Caribbean region that we are overdue. We are 100 years overdue for a seismic-related activity that can result in a tsunami. And that's why the governments of the Caribbean and all of the stakeholders, partner nations who are signed up with SEDEMA, has to embrace tsunami readiness in terms of our comprehensive approach to be able to manage disasters and to be able to address emergency response and risk reduction opportunities. Because we have been told that it is not a matter of if. We are now at a place where it's more a matter of when. And we're saying when we get to that place, there are some critical things that must have already been in place at the national level, at the community level, and at the personal level that would allow us to efficiently respond.
Mrs. Tafari, one of the things that is often overlooked, and I'm happy that you mentioned it, but whenever there is a disaster, we can speak about preparedness, we can speak about response, we can speak about during the disaster and all of that. But one of the things that sometimes is not given enough attention, and you mentioned it, is that psychosocial support. People suffer a lot of trauma, and even if you lose the material things, the loss comes with some psychological, emotional impact, that which you would have, lost. And sometimes I don't think that we think of that first. That comes like we think of it last, because we only think in terms of the material loss. But the real impact from disasters, yes, there's infrastructural loss, there's physical loss, and all of that. But there's a lot of damage done to persons, the trauma that they experience, the social displacement, and a lot of our resources and so on really needs to be placed there too. What do you think of that?
I definitely agree, and I think even with the COVID pandemic, we've seen the importance of psychosocial support, both for adults and also for children especially. So what has happened with COVID is that we've seen an increase in psychosocial support services. So there is a lot more services available for persons in this area. We would have seen Red Cross, for example, come on board. They would have trained their volunteers in providing psychosocial support. They would have provided cell phone numbers to their volunteers that persons can call in and get whatever support they need. Our counseling unit has also provided that psychosocial support, and the unit on an annual basis trains other frontline workers to do basic psychosocial support. So even before the issue becomes so major, that first frontline worker that you get into contact with, they can provide some basic support to let you know it's going to be okay, to provide some coping mechanisms for you so that you're able to get through another day. That you know it's not the end, it's a difficult time, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. And the support is now not only done on a face-to-face basis because of the COVID-19 restrictions, it's done virtually, either on the telephone, it can be done via WhatsApp messages, Facebook messages, Zoom, etc. So there are a lot of different avenues. The UNICEF has also provided some training for persons in education and our counseling unit in a program called Return to Happiness, and this targets children. So children who are exposed to trauma, they can be a part of this particular program to help them get back to a sense of well-being so that they can feel that they're safe, they're secure, and they're able themselves to cope with all of these changes that have occurred because of the disaster.
That is extremely important. We are out of time, actually. We can have another 5 minutes.
Mr. Williams, if you would permit me to...
Sure.
Yes, sir, because that's one angle. And then when you're looking at the persons who are responding at the NEOC level, we take it for granted oftentimes that these persons are away from their homes and their families for extended periods of time. And one of the things that the NEOC leadership would have brought into being since dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, we brought virtual psychosocial support into the Emergency Operations Center because we felt that persons were being burnt out. persons were working, looking after the nation's affairs, but their own households were left unattended, and that was weighing heavy on individuals. And at the same time, when persons are coming to respond, you have no idea what personal challenges they themselves would be facing, but they're responding. And so we didn't take that for granted. We introduced the team to virtual psychosocial support, and I was exposed to it, and I can tell you it is a very good tool. A very good tool, because it kind of helped the team to just adjust and realign their priorities and understand that the human part of you is allowed to feel this way, and then the professional part of you is expected to do certain things. We did basic brain exercises, physical exercises that would help with circulation and all of those things. And so I really want to support P.S. Louis Tafari in ensuring that psychosocial support steps to the front of the class and that we give it the necessary attention. And I can tell you that the agency will continue to champion the cause of psychosocial support as a part of our emergency response mechanism.
Okay, we are basically, but before we leave, I want you, for example, in 1 minute, just tell me, what are some of the lessons that would have been learned from the past? If you can just put it in a very short synopsis.
So I can try. The lessons that would have been learned over and not just from us here in St. Kitts or our exposure, but through our colleagues in other Caribbean countries, is that we need to invest in emergency response through any capacity, training, equipment, resource personnel. We need to invest in it, because at the end of the day, we are seeing the usefulness of it. We need to be able to understand the type of technology that is out there so that we can use it, and that is why the agency has gone ahead and invested in our own emergency broadcast unit. Because for you, Mr. Williams, as the person responsible for warning and communication, you no longer have to get to ZIZ. You can do all of what you do right from NEMA's headquarters in the NUC, and it is something I know that Mr. Abdia Samuel is extremely proud of, and the team, of course, because that puts us ahead of our preparedness and response initiative. I want to say that I think the biggest takeaway in terms of lessons learned and best practices for us in disaster is that no man is an island, and we need each other to be able to properly execute our responsibilities. And we want the cooperation of the citizens and residents, because what we are doing from our end is all to their benefit. And so we want persons, when these programs are aired and the information is presented, to be able to not keep it, just share it. And if they're in doubt, ask a question. The agency is always available to be able to answer any questions or address any concerns, and as well as our stakeholders. So thank you so much for that opportunity.
Mrs. Tafari?
I'm going to pick it up on something Mrs. said, and it's teamwork and cooperation. And we would have seen this come together beautifully over the past couple of months, where my subcommittee would have seen the teamwork with the Red Cross, our Ministry of Education, some private sector stakeholders, the Chamber of Industry and Commerce. And because of their efforts in helping us, we were able to be a little more efficient and effective in doing what it is we needed to do to address the emerging needs of persons during the lockdown period for the community spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. So teamwork and cooperation, it helps us to better handle our scarce resources, to get more assistance to people in a more timely and efficient manner.
Mr. Valentine?
Well, my departing words would make an appeal to the government to invest in providing maintenance for our buildings. I would recognize that we have a maintenance department, but some of the issues that we have at these shelters, a little maintenance, organized maintenance, scheduled maintenance would have gone a long way in preserving our assets. And so I would want to make an appeal that Let us get it right at this point in time. Because even some of the shelters we go to, and in the past you would have recognized that some of the issues that we have been there for a year, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Let us try to bring an end to that and move forward on a good note. So I'm making an appeal for the different departments and the different agencies that needs to ensure that our buildings are up to standard. Let us do that at this time, and then we can schedule proper maintenance going forward to preserve and protect our asset.
Thank you. I want to thank all three of you for coming and sharing today on something so important, how we prepare for disasters. We have to always be in a state of constant readiness. We cannot wait until a disaster impacts us or is an impending disaster to start to prepare. We must always be prepared. What is it? The Lord is going to come like a thief in the night. And so therefore, we must always be prepared. That is extremely important. So thank you to you, Mrs. Claricia Langley-Stevens, our Deputy National Disaster Coordinator. Thanks, Mrs. Janelle Lewis-Tafari, the Chair of the Welfare Relief Supplies and Shelter Management Subcommittee at NEOC, and Mr. Valentine Lindsay, the Chair of Housing and Shelter Subcommittee. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our listeners and our callers to today's program. Next week, we will be back with another edition of Working for You. Now, this is the first in a series of disaster preparedness, Working for You. So right now, we are talking disaster preparedness. Thank you very much. I am Les Roy Williams.